Good evening, Mora Elementary. I'm Benjamin Tipp, announcer, right here at Mora Elementary. During the course of a school year, day, or week, you are always asked the question, are you ready? Are you ready for class? Are you ready for PE? Are you ready for the day? Are you ready to learn? Well, Mustangs, as excitement builds right here at our school, through these halls, into our classrooms, I only have one question. Mustangs, are you ready? Mustangs, I said, are you ready? Then for the thousands in attendance, and for the millions watching around the world, and for all of us right here at Mora Elementary, let's get ready for the reading rumble! That's right, Mustangs. As promised, it's the first ever Reading Rumble Bracket Challenge. And we had those first 4 play-in matchups here, so let's take a look at those. We had Wrens defeating Strelo. We had Mrs. Samuelson's kindergarten class defeating Mrs. Holscher's class. We had Miss Shadeen just edging out Mrs. Lick's class, and then we had Mr. Nelson's class beating Miss Gustafson's class, which brings me to my next order of business. We got our first round here coming up, so let's take a look at some of these matchups, shall we? We got 32 classrooms, 16 matchups. Battling first, we got Miss Verdon and Miss Renz. Next, we got Miss Miller against Miss Erickson. Ooh, here's a fun matchup coming up. Our third matchup, we got Mrs. Anderson versus Mrs. Anderson. Then last in that top part of the bracket, we got Miss Nelson versus Mrs. Hambley. Now, the next portion of the bracket, we got Miss Callender versus Mrs. Samuelson. On to the next, we got Miss Peters versus Mrs. Bacher. Next, we have Mrs. Gams versus Mrs. Nelson in 4th grade. Lastly, on this first part of the bracket here, we got Miss Donahue versus Miss Westling. On to the next part, we got Mrs. Kep versus Miss Shadeen. Mrs. Hasselfeld versus Mr. Samuelson. Then we got Mr. Lukenbill versus Miss Joy. We got Miss Nolt versus Miss Rydberg. And our last 4 matchups are as follows. Mr. Norville versus Mr. Nelson. Miss Gamal versus Mrs. Schultz. Miss Ron Portal versus Miss Montel. And Miss Schmitz versus Miss Hoverson. There you have it. That's round 1. Tune in soon. We'll have more videos out there, and we'll see who makes it to our next round of the Reading Rumble Bracket Challenge.